Chapter 1. The Town That Was Waiting. The bus dropped me at the edge of Graridge Hollow just after 4 in the afternoon, which meant the light was already starting to fade. That's the thing about October in the Pacific Northwest, the sun gives up early, like it knows something you don't. I stood there on the shoulder of Highway 101 with my duffel bag and a backpack that held everything I owned, watching the Greyhound's taillights disappear around a curve thick with cedar and Douglas fir. The air smelled like wet bark and something sharper underneath. Pine sap, maybe. Or just the particular scent of a place that gets more rain than it knows what to do with. The town sat in a valley between two ridges covered in old-growth forest, the kind that looks black instead of green when the clouds hang low. And the clouds always hung low here, from what I could tell. Fog was already creeping down from the mountains to the west, moving like something alive, filling the spaces between trees before spilling onto the road. I pulled my jacket tighter. It wasn't that cold, not really, but I felt cold anyway. That's been happening more lately. My body not matching up with what the weather actually is. Sometimes I'm freezing when everyone else is fine. Other times I'm burning up and no one else seems to notice the heat. The caseworker had told me Graridge Hollow was quiet. A good place for a fresh start, she'd said, which is what they always say when they're running out of options. I'm 17, which makes me harder to place than the younger kids. Most foster families want someone small and grateful, someone who still believes things might get better. I stopped believing that around placement number 4. This was number 9. I started walking. The main road into town was 2 lanes of cracked asphalt with no sidewalk, just a gravel shoulder that crunched under my boots. On my left, a rusted chain-link fence marked off what used to be a logging yard, massive piles of cedar logs gone gray with age, equipment that looked like it hadn't moved in years, a crane with a broken arm, stacks of metal shipping containers tagged with faded graffiti. On my right, the forest pressed close. I could hear water running somewhere in there, a creek or drainage ditch cutting through the undergrowth. The sound made me think of all the things you can't see in the woods, all the spaces between trees where anything could be standing and watching and you'd never know until it was too late. I shook my head. That kind of thinking doesn't help. The first buildings appeared after maybe half a mile. A gas station with 2 pumps and a hand-painted sign that said Graridge Fuel and Supply, a diner with fogged-up windows and a neon open sign that flickered like it was trying to decide whether it meant it, a post office that looked like it had been built in the 1950s and never updated. Everything had that worn-down look, like the town was slowly being reclaimed by the forest around it. A pickup truck passed me going the opposite direction, and the driver, an older man with a thick beard, turned his head to watch me as he went by. Not just a glance, a full turn, eyes tracking me until he had to look back at the road. I told myself it was because I was new. Small towns notice strangers. That's normal. But something about the way he looked at me felt different, like he was confirming something instead of just being curious. I kept walking. The address the caseworker had given me was on Pinewood Drive, which turned out to be a residential street that branched off from the main road just past the diner. The houses were small and set back from the street, most of them with covered porches and yards that needed mowing. Some had cars in the driveways. Others looked empty, like maybe people had left and never come back. Number 47 was a single-story ranch with blue siding that had faded to almost gray. The porch light was on even though it wasn't quite dark yet. I stood at the end of the driveway for a minute, just looking at it, trying to figure out if this place would be better or worse than the last one. The front door opened before I could decide. A woman stepped out onto the porch, mid-50s, maybe, with short brown hair and a cardigan that looked hand-knitted. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Nervous, I thought, or maybe just tired. "Elijah?" she called. I nodded and walked up the driveway. "I'm Susan," she said when I reached the porch. "Susan Garrett. We spoke on the phone." "Well, I spoke with your caseworker, anyway. Come on in, you must be exhausted." I wasn't, but I didn't correct her. I followed her inside. The house smelled like coffee and something baking, banana bread, I realized when I saw the loaf cooling on the kitchen counter. The living room was small but clean, with a couch that looked like it had been reupholstered at least once and a television playing the local news on mute. Everything was beige and brown and safe. "Your room's down the hall," Susan said, gesturing toward a narrow corridor. "Second door on the left. It's not much, but it's yours for as long as you need it." I nodded again. I've learned not to say much during the first few hours. People expect you to be grateful and overwhelmed, and if you just stay quiet they fill in the blanks themselves. The room was exactly what I expected. A twin bed with a blue comforter, a dresser with 3 drawers, a desk under the window, a closet with wire hangers, neutral, temporary. A place designed not to feel like anything so you wouldn't get attached. I dropped my duffel on the bed and looked out the window. The backyard was mostly overgrown grass leading to a line of trees. Beyond that, the forest started in earnest, climbing up the ridge in layers of shadow. Something moved out there. I leaned closer to the glass, trying to see what it was, but the light was wrong and the trees were too thick. Probably a deer, or someone's dog, or nothing at all, just branches moving in the wind. I pulled the curtain closed. Susan told me I'd start school on Monday, which gave me 2 days to settle in and get to know the town. I spent most of Saturday walking around, trying to map the place in my head the way I always do. It's a survival thing, knowing where the exits are, where you can run if you need to, which streets are busy and which ones are empty. Greenwich Hollow wasn't big, maybe 2,000 people, if that. The main street had a hardware store, a library that was only open 3 days a week, a clinic, a sheriff's station with 2 patrol cars parked out front, and a building that might have been a community center or a church or both. Everything closed early. By 6 o'clock on Saturday night, the only places still lit up were the diner and the gas station. I kept noticing people watching me. Not obviously, not like they were staring. But I'd catch someone glancing over from across the street, or I'd walk past a storefront and see someone inside turn to look. A woman outside the hardware store. A man pumping gas. A teenager sitting on the bench outside the library. It made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being paranoid. New kid in a small town. Of course people were going to look. But it didn't feel like normal curiosity. It felt like recognition. Like they'd been expecting me. Monday morning came too fast. Susan drove me to school even though it was only a 10-minute walk. I think she was worried I'd bolt, which was fair. I've done it before. Greenwich Hollow High was a low brick building surrounded by parking lots and patchy grass, with a gym attached to one side and a set of portable classrooms out back that looked like they'd been there since the 80s. The whole place had that institutional smell, floor wax and old textbooks and cafeteria food. Susan walked me to the front office, where a secretary with reading glasses on a chain handed me a schedule and a map of the building. The principal wasn't there, which was fine by me. I've met enough principals to know the speech by heart. "You'll be in Mrs. Callahan's homeroom," the secretary said, not looking up from her computer. "Room 14. Down the hall. Take a left, 3rd door on the right." I thanked her and left before Susan could get emotional about it. The hallways were crowded with students pulling things out of lockers and talking in clusters. A few of them glanced at me as I passed, but most ignored me. That was normal. I'm good at being invisible when I need to be. Room 14 was half full when I got there. I picked a desk near the back by the windows and sat down, keeping my head low and my backpack on the floor between my feet. The teacher, Mrs. Callahan, I assumed, was writing something on the whiteboard. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of energy that suggested she actually liked her job. She turned around when the bell rang and smiled at the class. "Good morning, everyone. Before we get started, I want to introduce someone new." Her eyes found me in the back row. "Elijah Smith just moved to Greenwich Hollow. Let's make him feel welcome." A few people turned to look at me. I kept my expression neutral. "Elijah, if you need anything, just ask. We're a small school, so everyone knows everyone pretty quickly." I nodded. She went back to the board, and I thought that was the end of it. But then a girl sitting 2 desks over leaned toward me. "Hey," she said quietly. I looked at her. She was small, with long dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a gray hoodie and jeans, and there was a notebook open in front of her covered in handwriting so small I couldn't read it from where I sat. "I'm Maria," she said. "Elijah." "I know." She glanced toward the front of the room, then back at me. "Just so you know, people are going to ask you a lot of questions. You don't have to answer them if you don't want to." I frowned. Why would they ask questions? She shrugged. "New people are interesting. Especially here." There was something in the way she said it that made me think she meant more than she was saying. But before I could ask, Mrs. Callahan started talking about the week's assignments and the moment passed. By lunchtime, I'd been asked where I was from at least 6 times. I gave the same answer every time. Around. Vague enough to be true. Specific enough that people usually didn't push. The cafeteria was loud and smelled like industrial pizza and bleach. I grabbed a tray and found an empty table near the windows, hoping I could eat in peace. I was halfway through a sandwich I didn't really want when someone sat down across from me. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up. The guy was tall, maybe 6'2", with an athletic build and the kind of easy confidence that usually comes from being good at sports. He had light brown hair and a face that was friendly without being fake. He set his tray down before I could answer. "I'm Rowan," he said. "Rowan Haver, Elijah." "Yeah, I heard." He took a bite of his pizza, chewed, swallowed. "You settling in okay? It's been a day." He left. "Fair enough. Greenwich takes some getting used to. It's not like other places." "How so?" He paused, like he was choosing his words carefully. "It's quiet. People keep to themselves. But once you're part of things, it's a good place." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Rowan didn't seem bothered by my silence. He kept eating, occasionally glancing around the cafeteria like he was keeping track of who was where. It should have felt weird, but it didn't. He had this calm about him, like nothing could rattle him. Another guy joined us a few minutes later, shorter than Rowan, with dark hair and sharp features and eyes that didn't stop moving. He slid into the seat next to me without asking. "You're the new kid," he said. It wasn't a question. "Elijah," I said. He stuck out his hand, and I shook it. His grip was firm, almost too firm, like he was testing something. "Calder Voss, welcome to the most boring town in Washington." "It's not that bad," Rowan said. "It's exactly that bad." Calder turned his attention back to me. "So where'd you transfer from?" "Couple places, yeah? Like where?" I hesitated. There was something about the way he asked, too interested, too specific, that made me uncomfortable. "Moved around a lot." "Foster system?" The question hit me like cold water. I stared at him. "How did you?" "Lucky guess." He shrugged, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "So, you came here alone? No family tracking you down?" I felt my jaw tighten. "Why would you ask that?" "Just curious." He leaned back in his chair, casual, like he hadn't just asked the most invasive question possible. "Small town, you know. People talk." "Nobody's talked to you about me," I said. "I just got here." Calder smiled. "True. Just making conversation." Rowan shot him a look I couldn't quite read, and Calder raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax. I'm just being friendly." I didn't believe him, but I didn't know what to do about it. So I went back to my sandwich and tried to ignore the way my hands were shaking. After lunch, I had history and then biology, both of which passed in a blur of syllabi and seating charts. By the time the final bell rang, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the classes. I walked out the front entrance and stopped at the top of the steps, looking out at the parking lot and the street beyond. That's when I saw him. A man standing across the road, leaning against a dark blue pickup truck with his arms crossed. He was tall, taller than Rowan, maybe 6'4", with broad shoulders and a stillness that made him look like he'd been carved out of stone. He wore a faded jacket and jeans, and even from a distance I could see the way his eyes tracked the students leaving the building. Tracked me. I felt it like a physical thing. That gaze. Heavy, deliberate. I looked away, then looked back. He was still watching. Something about him felt dangerous. Not in the way that makes you want to run, but in the way that makes you want to understand what you're dealing with before you decide whether to run. I started down the steps, keeping him in my peripheral vision. He didn't move. I reached the sidewalk and turned left, heading toward Pinewood Drive. When I glanced back, he was gone. The truck was still there, but the man had disappeared. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know why. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle and the wind move through the trees outside. My body felt wrong again. Too hot, too tight, like my skin didn't fit right. I kicked off the blankets, but it didn't help. Around midnight, I gave up and got dressed. Susan was asleep. I could hear her snoring softly from her room at the other end of the hall. I slipped out the front door as quietly as I could and started walking. The streets were empty. Most of the houses were dark, and the only light came from the occasional porch lamp or street light. The air was cold and damp, and I could see my breath, but I still felt like I was burning up from the inside. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to move. I ended up near the old logging yard without really meaning to. The chain-link fence was still there, rusted and sagging in places, and beyond it the equipment loomed like sleeping giants. The fog had rolled in thick, turning everything into shapes and shadows. That's when I heard it. A sound like metal scraping against metal, sharp and sudden. Then a shout, someone yelling, the words lost in the distance. I stopped walking. Another sound. A crash, like something heavy hitting the ground. Then silence. I should have turned around. I should have gone back to the house and locked the door and pretended I hadn't heard anything. Instead, I climbed the fence. The metal was cold and rough under my hands, and the top bar wobbled when I pulled myself over, but I managed. I dropped down on the other side and started moving toward the sounds. The logging yard was a maze of rusted machinery and stacked lumber, and the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I moved carefully, trying not to trip over anything, following the direction I thought the sounds had come from. I heard voices, low and urgent, coming from somewhere near the center of the yard. I crept closer, staying low, using the equipment as cover. Two men were standing near an overturned shipping container. They wore dark clothing and carried something that looked like a cross between a cattle prod and a taser, metal rods with glowing tips that hummed with electricity. One of them was speaking into a radio. "Target confirmed." "Repeat, target confirmed. We're moving to intercept." My blood went cold. Target. They were hunting something. Or someone. I should have left. I should have run. But I stayed frozen behind a stack of pallets, watching. One of the men gestured toward the far end of the yard, and they both started moving in that direction. I waited until they were out of sight, then followed. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed to know what they were hunting. Maybe because some part of me already knew it had something to do with me. I heard the struggle before I saw it. Snarling. Growling. The sound of something heavy slamming into metal. I rounded the corner of a crane and stopped. There was something in the shadows. Something big. It moved too fast for me to see clearly, but I caught glimpses, fur, maybe, or scales, I couldn't tell. It was fighting the two men, and they were losing. One of them went down hard, his weapon skittering across the pavement. The other one backed up, shouting into his radio. "We need backup. It's..." The thing lunged. The man screamed. And then heat exploded in my chest. It was like someone had lit a fire inside my ribcage. I gasped, stumbling backward, pressing my hand against my sternum. The heat spread outward, down my arms, into my fingers. I looked down. My hands were glowing. Not metaphorically. Not like a trick of the light. They were actually glowing, orange and red like coals in a fire, and I could feel the heat radiating off them. I tried to shake it off, tried to make it stop, but it only got worse. The glow intensified, and then... flames. Actual flames, curling up from my palms like I was holding a torch. I shouted and stumbled backward, slamming into the crane behind me. The metal was cold against my back, but my hands were burning, and I couldn't make it stop. The two men had stopped fighting. They were staring at me now, their faces pale in the firelight. What the hell? One of them raised his weapon. The flames in my hands flared brighter, hotter, and I felt something inside me surge forward, something wild and furious and not entirely human. The men ran. They didn't say anything, didn't try to fight. They just turned and bolted, disappearing into the fog. I stood there, shaking, staring at my hands. The flames were gone. I turned my palms over, looking for burns, for blisters, for any sign of what had just happened. There was nothing. No, wait, there were marks. Faint lines across my palms and fingers, like scorch marks, dark against my skin. But even as I watched, they started to fade. Within seconds, they were gone completely. I felt like I was going to throw up. What the hell was that? What the hell am I? I heard a sound behind me and spun around. A man was standing at the edge of the yard, half hidden in the fog. Tall, broad-shouldered, the same man I'd seen outside the school. He was watching me with eyes that caught the light like an animal's, golden and unblinking. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness like he'd never been there at all. I stood there alone in the logging yard, my hands still tingling, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. And I realized with absolute certainty that nothing about Ridge Hollow was an accident. Someone had been waiting for me.